Hello, my name is John Stoltz, Director of Customer Experience for ASCM, and I'll be your host for today's webinar, Doubling Down on Supply Chain Digital Capabilities, Resetting Your Supply Chain to be More Resilient, Sustainable, and Circular. I'm pleased to be joined today with Peter Bolstorff with ASCM and Chris Richard with Deloitte Consulting. Welcome, Peter and Chris. Obviously, this is a super relevant topic area to our community, so let's go ahead and dive right in.
Thanks, John, and welcome to our nearly 2,000 member audience. And I'd like to say good afternoon, but essentially when you look at the geographic scope, I'd have to say good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. So I am Peter Bolstorff, Executive Vice President for Supply Chain and Corporate Development with ASCM. And I'd like to welcome my colleague, Chris Richard, and he'll introduce himself when he gets to that point in the presentation. Today we're going to take you through a very practical discussion around our corporate community at ASCM, the lessons learned within the COVID-19, and how that relates to digital investments. So I'm going to take the introduction. I'm going to go through the introduction of our new SCOR Digital Standard. For those of you that are SCOR geeks out there, you're going to be very excited. Chris is going to take us through a tour of the digital capabilities model for supply networks, kind of the future. And then together we're going to talk about how Deloitte and ASCM are collaborating on joint programs to help accelerate impact for all of you. And then I'm going to kick it back to John and we'll finish up with a little Q&A. So with that, let me take you through kind of an introduction of our corporate community. So I started in 2014, and we now have over 300 corporations that have aligned with ASCM as part of our transformation solutions, sustainability solutions, our foundation solutions in the community, and talent development. Of that 300, 200 or so are in the global 2,000. We are across industry. We are truly global. Almost 2/3 of our corporate community are rated in Gartner's top 25. Annually, we engage with about 7,500 of their corporate employees, and there are about 1,000 leaders that are involved in our thought leadership, either through volunteerism or content, webinars, etc. If I were to double click on that 1,000, and we were to look at how that breaks out individually by role, about 20% of them are executives. They oversee end-to-end supply chain, so a VP of supply chain or a chief supply chain officer. 40% of them oversee one or more processes, director level. 25% are process leaders, S&OP manager, and then we have about 15% that are process experts. So when you think about that community, when we talk about lessons learned in COVID-19, preparedness, response, and recovery, this is the group that we're focusing on. So let's talk a little bit about that COVID-19 impact. We know that the majority of the ASCM corporations that I just talked about have some form of digital transformation roadmap, though none are defined the same. And so there's a wide range of what defines a digital transformation roadmap and what kinds of capabilities belong to that. What we also know is COVID-19 did not change the roadmap. It simply amplified the need. And so we were having a lot of questions around moving forward. What kinds of digital investments will make my supply chain more resilient, more sustainable, and more circular? So, if we were to look at kind of the summary of the lessons so far, aside from the idea around double down on digital investments, and that doesn't just mean, taking out more Zoom subscriptions. That really talks about, what process areas were really critical in this time, and then how do I really focus my investments in digital. The second lesson was, how do I fully integrate risk management with synchronized planning? So a lot of companies are trying to get a tighter weave between those two processes. A third lesson is how do we become more effective in public-private collaboration, really especially around critical care types of items in the, with inventory transparency as a focal point. A fourth lesson is how do we rebalance global supply networks, especially with agility, this idea around being able to respond to unplanned demand. How do we rebalance those networks as a competitive advantage? And then lastly, gosh, I'm not sure many people had, pandemic in their risk management playbook prior to COVID-19, as it relates to global health. But there's a corollary that says as we start to think about climate change, what other, I'll call it catastrophic things do we need to think about and how would we respond? And so this webinar, we're going to focus on the digital investment piece. All right, so there's two parts to this conversation. How do I define my baseline, and then how do we really define the capabilities needed? So for many of you, and I've been around SCOR since 1996, I've seen every version, have participated in it. SCOR truly is the global standard in defining supply chains. We know over 5,000 organizations have used SCOR to develop their process baselines. Again, those of you who have seen this graphic, SCOR defines supply chain, plan, source, make, deliver, return, and enable from supplier, supplier, to customer. SCOR has four main components to it. There's a process decomposition. There's a performance hierarchy in terms of metrics. We have practices and people. And so about a year and a half ago, a lot of our corporate community needed to know how do I take this SCOR to the next level? How do we really think about digital capabilities? And that's where we're going to talk about that collaboration with Deloitte in a minute. So I am so excited to introduce to the community now, based on a lot of hard work, within our volunteer base and staff. We have now just launched the new SCOR Digital Standard, and that features, a completely digital interface. It's compatible with the digital capabilities model for supply networks, as you'll see. Again, it's integrated in a digital platform. It's mobile friendly, so it does a nice job with that. We have special application downloads for both sustainability as well as oncology. And then there are new practice groupings for technology, process, and organization. So for those of you that are ASCM members, corporate or professional, you can see the click through. So very excited about that. So let me just talk a little bit about four concepts around the baseline. So we talked about one of the lessons being this idea around placing agility, as a competitive advantage. And for those of you that have used SCOR before, this is probably the most strategic category of metrics, and it's also the most, I'll call it gray in defining it. But when we think about agility, it's how long or how many days does it take you to be able to respond to unplanned demand? And in the COVID-19 experience, agility has been one of those things that has been a very critical element because, again, nobody could forecast a pandemic. So the idea is how do we respond to these ideas around unplanned demand? And so again, I think agility is going to play an even bigger role in competitive advantage. And so one of the questions that we want to get at is what kinds of digital investments, in terms of digital development, connected customers, will allow us to really take advantage of that metric. A second, concept that I want to talk about in terms of the baseline from a SCOR blueprint standpoint is this idea around the process blueprint. So, the intent here is not that everybody read this blueprint. This essentially is taking all the SCOR level 3 elements and putting them together into what I would call a normal way of operating a supply chain, from deliver to make to source to return to plan. So the idea is, companies that actually have set up their process baselines around SCOR, probably have a red, yellow, green chart. So where do I have, processes that are good, green? Where do I have processes that are yellow, they need improvement, and where do I have processes that are broken or missing, or red? But using this blueprint as a launching point, one of the questions that you can say is, within plan or within make or within source, what process groups, do I want to think about doubling down on digital investments? Where do I achieve competitive advantage, in my particular market or industry? And so this idea is having a blueprint to launch from makes the idea of selecting the right capabilities that much easier, more straightforward. A next concept that I just want to share with the audience is this idea around practice maturity. And so we did a poll everywhere with our leadership group, trying to assess, if you think about planning, between reconciliation of the unit plan to budget, supply planning and rough cut capacity, conversion of weekly tactical plan to daily execution, demand planning, conversion of that monthly rough cut to weekly tactical, and this whole idea around sales marketing and new product development input into S&OP. We were trying to get a sense of, where's the maturity lie within that particular practice group. And you can see here, because almost everybody has to, align unit to budget. When we look at the demand side of the house, that ends up being, towards the bottom. And when you think about your digital investments, one of the thoughts is how can I leverage the digital investment to leapfrog the maturity of the practice? And so again, we see that there's a general weakness or gap, within the demand planning and the demand side of the house. So one of the questions that we know our corporations are asking about is how do I invest in the right digital capabilities to leapfrog that part of the planning? So this is kind of my last transition slide, and we'll kind of dive into the digital capabilities model. But I'm going to tell you a little story. So we know, if we were to look at our corporations, we know that there were some supply chain excellent companies who sensed this idea of they sensed the COVID-19 on their demand side in December. And so they got a sense that, because they're an international company, they got a sense that demand was being affected by the virus in December. They were able to take and leverage investments that they'd made in artificial intelligence and cognitive learning. They were able to run scenarios in January that were then incorporated into their February S&OP cycle that were then acted on in March. And so if you look at this blueprint, this essentially takes from the left, the supply planning part of S&OP. It looks at how does that then break down into the tactical plans, in distribution requirements planning, MPS, and plan source, and then how does it work its way to the right through execution. And so the corporations that had doubled down already were able to leverage those investments in this blueprint and actually have been able to shift, from store level sales to e-commerce and all those other things that have enabled them to kind of work their way through the COVID response. So I think the key takeaway from my section is supply chain excellent companies, or those companies that are looking at doubling down, are best served by having some kind of a baseline, having some understanding of the performance, competitive advantage, and the objectives that they're trying to make, and have some focus area for those investments, as opposed to trying to double down everywhere. So again, lots to say on this subject. Again, the takeaway is what digital capabilities will enable your company. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and he's going to give you a tour and some comments on the DCM. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. And just a word of introduction. So I've been working in the supply chain profession since the early 90s, and like Peter, I mean, I think Peter mentioned he started working with SCOR in 96, and I think it might have been 1997 for me, but one of the, I found SCOR incredibly valuable, but one of the things that always kind of nagged at me about SCOR is it suggests the kind of a sequential, paradigm. We plan demand, then we plan for manufacturing, then we plan for materials, and all the supply chain professionals will recognize this dynamic, right, that it can generate, which is the bullwhip effect, right? As my planning requires, delays as I pass information from one node back upstream to the next, as I sometimes place judgments on those demand signals or, additional orders, for example, the variability increases and increases, and it creates this well-known effect. And so I've always, thought for years, what could we do differently? If we implemented more of a network kind of thinking, network model of how we operate these supply networks, not supply chains, what could we do to really counter this effect that has plagued supply chains, for literally millennia, right? Back to the days of Alexander the Great. So what we had been working on for a long time, and we're happy, years ago to start collaborating with Peter and the rest of ASCM was exactly this, right? How do we shift from a supply chain that largely has the sequential, linear, handoff kind of paradigm around planning and execution to one that was much more dynamically interconnected, connected between, different parts of the network that might not traditionally have been connected, and really lit up and enabled by all the different technologies we have available today, where we have, visibility into our orders and our shipments and our demand, really like we never have before. Just wanted to summarize here what we're really trying to accomplish for those of you that haven't had the opportunity to see this before. What we're really doing here is we're producing a model we call the DCM, or Digital Capabilities Model, for supply networks to help all of you envision, well, how could this network look? Like, what are the different capabilities? How do they relate to each other? So that I can go ahead and build them and build a more robust and resilient network that Peter was just describing. A couple of the ads we initially made out of the gate were we added connected customer and digital development, right? These are not areas that had been addressed in the core SCOR model, though had been addressed in some adjacent areas. And the other thing we're looking at in terms of scope is how do we integrate with the very close adjacent functions, sales, right, finance, marketing. All of these organizations are partners in running a supply chain, and we wanted to make sure we expanded the envelope of looking at, how do we really, work with those adjacent functions. And just in terms of the progression, we did the first release at conference last September in Las Vegas. We're very excited to do that. And this year, next year, we'll be releasing more and more functionality up through 2022. In terms of guiding principles here, you probably picked up a bit on these, but there's really three that are guiding us. So number one is whole systems thinking. How do all the pieces fit together? And I just talked about that. Enterprise optimization, I kind of hinted at too, right? Let's get away from thinking about supply chain in a box and think about supply chain as a very tightly integrated part of the enterprise. And then lastly, digitally enabled. That's kind of implied in the name, but it's really a different way of thinking, right? It's like, what can technology do for us to help us really break this problem of the bullwhip effect, and what can we do fundamentally different? So as a quick compare and contrast, and this is a graphic many of you have probably seen before, but it's evolving. The different paradigms here are a chain versus a network. We've talked about that. In terms of how is it organized, right? In SCOR, we decompose processes to increasing levels of granularity. the concept in the DCM is digital threads, or how do different capabilities tie together. SCOR really goes to 3 levels. DCM with our first release is at 2 levels, though we're working towards bringing that to an increased level of granularity. Peter just mentioned when he was talking about the SCOR Digital Standard that we've been building the cross references between the 2 models here, right? So that if you're working in one, you can see the relationship to the other. And then the last thing I'll kind of hit here is where we say, control systems. The SCOR model is really a great kind of, what's my input, how do I process it, and what's my output. And the paradigm we're introducing and getting people to think about and get comfortable with in a network, it's different, right? It's I sense, I then collaborate within the network in a way that helps me find an optimal solution, and then I respond. So the paradigm where we've designed this around and are working to communicate and embellish is that sense, collaborate, optimize, respond. That's kind of an overview of DCM and where we're going. And and if you haven't played with the model, you're an ASCM member, just log in to dcm.ascm.org, log in with your ASCM credentials and play around with it. I mean, most people that start poking around find it really interesting and really helpful in terms of visualizing these different capabilities and how they relate to one another. So the other part I wanted to cover, Peter, is with COVID popping up and all of us having to deal with it in various ways, both personally and professionally. Below the 6 level 1 capabilities that we were illustrating graphically in the last couple pages lie 39 level 2 capabilities. And of those 39 level 2 capabilities, I've selected 9 here that are really relevant to our current situation. And so just want to take about a minute or a little less for each of these 9 and just flash through them and just talk a little bit about what they are and why they're relevant. And again, everyone can go explore more on their own. So on each of these pages, you'll see a graphic of the model on the left, and it's a screenshot from the web page. This is exactly what you'd see if you go there, and the definition on the right. So we wanted to start with connected customer, monitoring and insights. This is about this capability to have kind of real-time, persistent feeds from your customer on, what is their usage, what is their ordering, as well as incorporating more advanced capabilities like artificial intelligence to detect changes in patterns of demand and get proactive about that, right? So I haven't checked with any of our clients to see what kind of capability they had in to monitor the toilet paper situation when that all started to happen. But that's a really good example, right, of being able to pick up on that changing pattern very quickly and very quickly responds to it is what we're talking about. Responsive demand supply matching. So this is what you would do with that, right? Okay, hey, anomaly in toilet paper demand, right? What do we do about that, right? So this is really a digitally enabled capability to very rapidly and very precisely respond to those changes in demand, propagate that through the supply network to look at equipment, labor, material availability, and replan, right? And figure out, okay, well, what am I going to do, right? What can I fill from a warehouse? What do I need to start additional production? Dynamic flow optimization. So this is really looking at, now that I'm responding to a change in my demand supply balance here that is atypical. How do I dynamically address this, right? Where's all my inventory? What's finished goods? What's work in process? Do I keep with my existing operational plan, or do I need to make changes, reroute inventory from one geography to another, or accelerate inbound orders, for example? So that's what dynamic flow optimization is. Then we've got adaptive network response. So this is kind of in the classic, logistics capability here. But this, I think, is really showing up with COVID on when we've got single points of failure in a distribution network, right? And the concept of adaptive network response here is to have options, to have built-in resiliency here, right? So if you're overflowing in one warehouse, for example, to be able to move to a different one. Same thing on logistics. If your typical most cost-efficient route is overloaded, what's an alternative route you can use to move your materials? Optimal pass. So given what I just said, that price sounds inefficient, right? I'm going from my lowest cost, transportation route, for example, to one that's not so low cost. So the optimal pass selection is, how am I looking at the whole network here? Inbound, outbound, storage costs, transportation costs, and how do I rapidly rebalance or replan here and come up with the best way to respond to that change in demand, given my supply, given my capacity, given my constraints. We've got 3 more here. I just want to hit Peter, and I'll turn it back over to you. So total operations synchronization, right? So this is back into the factory, right? So, and this is, Peter, I thought it was really interesting, the bar chart you'd shown earlier around the relative maturity of the different practices, right? And the more strategic kind of S&OP practice was more mature, and as you came down into monthly buckets, into scheduling, it got less and less mature. This is exactly addressing that point, Peter. It's well, when we come down to an actual factory, how do we keep synchronized, and how do we make sure we've got enough material, enough labor, enough tooling, enough equipment capacity to be able to respond to that change in demand, and how do we reschedule, and how do we commit, right? How do we commit back out to our sales teams and our customers on when we can meet that demand? Supplier collaboration. So clearly, I say one of the good and bad things about this whole COVID situation is everyone in the world finally knows what a supply chain is, right?
Yes, they do.
No matter what television station you tune into, right? They're talking about the supply chain and how global it is, right? So and this is a great example when we say supplier collaboration of people, process, and technology as a capability, right? If you had a good process in place, but you didn't have relationships, you're probably in trouble right now, right? The better use you've made of technology to communicate with your suppliers bidirectionally, the companies that are doing that better, right, are having an easier time of things right now. But this is a great example of people, process, and technology all needed to really have that synergistic collaborative relationship with the supplier, and being able to deal with disruptions. This is shifting. The last 2 here, we're going to shift gears a little bit. Pretty much everything I've been talking about is the products we make today, the products we make, we plan, source, make, and deliver today. But what about the products that are coming next, right? So I largely work in the high-tech industry, and one of the interruptions we're seeing that's not affecting us as consumers today, but will in the near future, is the delay of new product introductions, right? Because when you introduce a new product, it takes engineering support. It often takes traveling to the factory where you're going to introduce this product, and being able to continue that pipeline of development to bring in new products and introduce them is something we're starting to look at. So development collaboration ecosystem is all about digitizing the CAD models, the simulation models, everything such that companies can work much more effectively across their boundaries, both within the company itself as well as with their suppliers and customers to develop new products, is accelerated proof of concept. And this is, again, kind of relying on a more digitally enabled development ecosystem. It's the ability to respond and use different methods for proving the concept. 3D printing, rapid feedback, integration of digital twin models from a 3D printer to say a 5-axis CNC machine as you move from development into production. So these are all examples, Peter, but again, just wrapping up with the first 7 were more about the products I have today. These last 2, 8 and 9, are more about, what we could be doing in this environment to more effectively collaborate in a virtual manner to introduce the products we were counting on coming later this year.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So let's just, again, and I want everybody, all the audience to start thinking about this as well, right? So when you start thinking about the headlines and what you think is, like, for example, Medtronic is now collaborating with Foxconn in Wisconsin to build ventilators. Right now, the national strategy for the U.S., how are we going to anticipate, requirements for testing, and then how do we in aggregate look at, supply, not only inventory that's here, but also, supply of swabs, reagents, and whatnot. I think when you think about, food service, and, again, I go down to my main street in my very small town, there's been a lot of innovation even at the restaurant level in terms of connecting to your customers and establishing loyalty using, easy platforms where you can order from your house and then do curbside pickup. So I think what I want everybody to take away from the conversation to this point is the tools to have, an established supply chain, plan, source, make, deliver, return, and enable blueprint. It's made companies excellent. And I think, what Chris just highlighted with these 9 is you need to start thinking about, of the total number of digital capabilities that, that you could have within the DCM model, what are the most important ones to you as you start to reset your supply chain strategy to be more resilient in the future, to be more sustainable and circular. So again, our objective with this webinar was to really introduce the new SCOR Digital Standard and that connectivity, and then this idea around having a baseline blueprint and then determining your digital capabilities. So so what I want to talk about next is, because everybody's going, okay, well, those are interesting, and we're going to play around with those. But the next question is, so what? What do I do next? What is the call to action? So we're going to together, Chris and I are going to talk about some joint programs, that will help you and your company learn, how to leverage these things. So let me start. So the ASCM has a transformation learning program, we call it. And this learning program is, again, based on, SCOR implementations that date back to 1996. So, again, we're using the best of the best. Think about this program as kind of a facilitated or a guided process using one of the SCOR master instructors. Some key outputs that you're going to get. You're going to get your supply chain segmentation and competitive requirements. You're going to get metric analyses, including failure modes and effects. You're going to get your process blueprint along with your RACI that will help you with your organizational structure. You're going to get a practice analyses, including what Chris is going to talk about, the DCM Digital Readiness. We're also including our enterprise standard for sustainability. And then the last thing is you're going to get a portfolio of things that you want to improve that have true operating income impact. We're able to break that down. Again, think about it as a kind of a black belt, approach where we're teaching. Again, the days of face-to-face workshops are going to be gone. So we've completely digitized this process where, they're digitally enabled using Zoom or some other similar platform. But again, I'm not going to go through each one, but it's basically workshop focused where we're teaching your team around a particular focus. We have some key outputs, that they're driving to. And the last thing is really trying to aim at this portfolio or strategic focus areas of improvement. At this point, we prioritize those based on the impact to the metric. In this chart, this is an actual chart based on 90 SCOR transformation programs. These are kind of the 12 typical focus areas coming out of a transformation learning program. And X denotes, which metric within the SCOR framework are we impacting. but you can also look at each metric and look at which program had the largest impact. You can look at kind of strategic focus area number 7. It actually impacts 3 metric areas. It has the largest impact in 3 metric areas, which is why you see a lot of people focus on it. So having this list, as a baseline set of things will help you prioritize and the digital capabilities in terms of how do you kind of leverage those investments to leapfrog ahead. So again, our process, again, transformation learning program guided by a mentor, very much a digital learning experience now that has real value at the end. So again, I'm going to kick it back to Chris because I know we worked together on how either this process can be done independent of or together with the DCM. So back to you, Chris.
Sure. Yeah, just following on what you're saying, Peter, when we, made the announcement and, did the initial launch at conference in September, it was really interesting to see, different people come up, especially at the booth where we had the big interactive touch screen and just see people envision, different ways they could use, a capabilities model. But we've also had a lot of people saying, hey, can you give me more of a recipe or a process on how to use it? And so what we've done in the next couple of pages here is we have 2 kind of approaches, and we're gonna load these up onto the model website probably the first week of May. But we lay them out in 2 ways. So number 1, if you already have a SCOR blueprint, you already completed transformation learning program, you feel you've got a good starting point, what does that look like? And then if you don't, if you're kind of starting from scratch, what does that look like? And but the goal here is to get you a plan about where you're going to go and with a bunch of the supporting details. So this first one here is the sequence, and so again, this is a preview. We're going to upload this as PDF files in another week or 2, and you'll be able to download it and print it out along with some supporting detail behind it. But this is assuming you don't have a transformation learning program and you want to self-guide, and so it's pretty self-explanatory, but start with, well, what are my goals, right? How do I, what's my company strategy? How do I intend to win? We then move on, or you can move on to say, okay, well, given those goals, where do I really want to focus, right? What are the big opportunities I have? We talked about some of those. They can be driven by COVID, they can be driven by other things, but where do I really want to get serious and make my investments, and based off of those opportunities, well, using the model, well, which of the capabilities do I need? And the power of the model is to show the relationships between different capabilities, and people commented this at conferences, hey, I've been really focused on whatever capability A, but I never really thought about how I'm dependent on someone else, right, in another department, right, to get this put in place. So for example, it doesn't do me good to have a really great responsive demand supply matching capability in place if I don't also have dynamic flow optimization, can't reroute product, right, based off of changes. So moving on to step D is gap assessment, right? What do I have right now versus what do I need? And and then that moves into the step of developing an actual roadmap and figuring out the right sequence. So here we're illustrating that, hey, if you've already done a TLP, you've already accomplished a lot of what's in steps A and B, and so you're at a point where you can move more rapidly down the path. So Peter, I think that's what we wanted to share, a preview of what's coming here in the next few weeks, and just give everyone that's attending here a preview on that, and know to check back, and you'll be able to download this soon.
Great, thanks, Chris. Again, to the audience, I think be asking yourself some key questions right now. Is do I have a pretty good supply chain baseline? And again, thinking about SCOR, do I have my metric scheme? Do I have my process baseline? Do I have prioritized focus areas? From a practice standpoint, and do I have the right skills and competencies? And then on the DCM side, do I have the right prioritized list of digital capabilities, based on where, on my strategy is going? And again, I want to go back to, I think all of those things existed before COVID. I think what COVID's doing right now is amplifying the need and accelerating the pace of change. I know in our own organization, we've been on remote duty here for almost 6 weeks, and there's the obvious things on how do you communicate with each other digitally using those kind of technologies, but the conversations that I'm having now with supply chain leaders are, this was on our list. We needed to do more rapid demand supply matching before, but now in the new world, in the new normal, we've got to do it today. And fortunately, there's technology continues to get bigger, better, and cheaper. And you've got lots of options out there. So again, the objective for this webinar was to really introduce 2 new sets of the SCOR Digital Standard to help you with that, the DCM model to help you with those priorities, and to really leverage those tools as all of you come out of this COVID, response and into a recovery. We know for a fact, and we'll be publishing this here in the month of May, based on our research, we know supply chain excellent companies outperform their competition, and especially in recessionary type environments where you have to think both on demand side and the supply side. We know that supply chain excellence companies win share, as they come out of that. So with that, I'm going to kick it back to John Stoltz, our host. John, I know you've got some audience questions, so back to you, my friend.
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter. Thank you, Chris. Really great information, a lot to digest. Let me start. I was in a recent conversation talking about AI, and supply chain professional I was speaking with, focused on its pillars are data, talent, and trust, and all 3 of those are required in order to really optimize that. As we think about the digital investments, whether it's the SCOR Digital Standard or DCM, is it really at the core building trust, or how does all that kind of come together?
Well, I'm going to let Chris take that one first, but I'll go second.
Well, John, I know you and I have we've never talked about this, but I was, kind of humming to myself as you were saying that, is actually, I agree with that trust piece. We have, if you look at kind of the spectrum from raw data to that may not have good quality to, data that, is of high quality and is more structured and you can do something with, and then kind of the basic analytics on that and AI on top of that. I was laughing to myself because we refer to that as progressing along a trust curve. And the reason is, if you don't have that, starting with that fundamental, if you don't have data you believe in, then it's the old garbage in, garbage out metaphor, right? You don't have anything. Right. And as you get up into at least let's if I limit the description of AI right now to machine learning, right? By definition, these become black boxes, right? And so when you get to that stage, you need to trust the data inputs, and you need to trust what's in that black box, right? And if you don't trust both of those, then you don't trust the output. So there's a lot of change management and learning around, well, what does it take to work with AI, because of both of those types of trust that need to be built.
So John, I'm gonna take it up at the shareholder level. We did, as part of our Chief Supply Chain Officer Forum last year, we talked about the trust index. And when you start thinking about what COVID-19 has done, is it's really put a magnifying glass on those companies that had supply chains that you could trust. Maybe they didn't deliver on time every time, but they could tell you when they would be back in stock. They could tell you, what you could substitute. So I think the idea around trust at the patient, at the consumer, wherever that end point of the supply chain lands, I think that's a trust factor that everybody's going to have to comprehend here as we come out of this pandemic. It's not just inside my organization, and it's not just with me and my supplier and me and my customer. It's how do I make sure that my supply chain uses sustainable materials? How do I ensure that the person buying my product knows that that I'm respecting the environment. Again, digital investments are going to help that process. I know a lot of the things that Chris talked about around development, we're very excited to have these capabilities now part of the integration with the SCOR Digital Standard. How do I start 3D printing things? I mean, there's probably 25 articles that I saw in the last 3 weeks that talked about, how do I start 3D printing, materials? How do I start thinking about 3D printing houses on Mars, for that matter? So anyway, so that's just double down on that comment. Trust is important internally as well as at the very end.
Yeah, it does seem that trust is really the core of collaboration, right? And without it, you don't have this whole systems thinking, Chris, that you referenced, or the enterprise optimized. That foundation is not in place. So, Peter, just another question. You opened the presentation and said the majority of our ASCM corporate clients have digital transformation roadmap, that none are defined the same. As you look ahead, look forward, again, we have so much, so many resources, so many options to pursue. Do you think there will be a standardized best practice approach for how companies will work to solve this, or do you think the solution is unique as well?
Well, again, I always go back to the idea is, in chaos, you've got to have something that kind of organizes things, right? Because in a chaotic, system, nothing works together. And what we're hoping to do is to bring some structure and some standardization to this very chaotic, it seems, digital transformation. And I think because nobody had the same definition of what do you mean by that, it could range from, hey, I'm going to use Zoom to, I'm going to invest in AI to do, my replenishment planning, for me. I think what the SCOR Digital Standard and what DCM does is it puts some structure around how do I prioritize those investments. And I know in talking with Chris before, we see a lot of companies, if I can get a handle on what my strategic focus areas are and I know what problem I'm trying to solve, I can do very smart investments on technology and capabilities that I can test. And then I can see value. And then I can then scale that investment appropriately. So, Chris, to you.
Yeah, I think, how many different ways is SCOR used, John? I think, there's, it's up to the imagination, and I like what Peter just said. What we're trying to do is provide reference models, tools, ways of thinking to help make this more structured, help make it more predictable, but not be overly prescriptive or formulaic. And we'll be, adding more structure over the years here as we go. But, the beauty of innovation comes when people can be creative and you arm them with enough tools that they can go do things you never even thought of when you first created the tool. So I'm looking forward, every year to the journey and seeing, where people run with some of these things. It's fascinating and it's exciting.
Great. We'll close on that note and with that positive note of better days ahead for everyone. So that's all the time we have for today. Peter and Chris, thank you for taking the time to be with us, with the audience, for sharing these great insights. This concludes today's webinar. All content and materials included in this ASCM online event are the property of ASCM and are protected by the United States and international copyright laws. All rights are reserved.